Hello, I'm Steph from My Driver Classic, and today we're celebrating 50,000 subscribers on the channel with a rather unique test drive. Well, for the UK anyway. We're testing this 1960s Mark II Austin 1800 ute, and it's come all the way from Australia. I believe it's one of only one or two examples in the UK, and this one is particularly special and well known around the world. It won, I think it was the modified show in 2011 in Sydney, and it got then imported into the UK, and it's lived here ever since. Hasn't really been seen much since lockdown, and we've bagged a test in it, and we're going to show you it today. And I'm going to talk to you about some of the differences between this and the standard 1800 that you might recognise from the roads of Britain of yesteryear. Whenever we talk about 1800s, I love mentioning that the 1800, which is sometimes badged as the BMC ADO17, was designed by Alec Issigonis. Now, he was a genius back in the day. He designed the Mini, the Morris Minor, the 1100, 1300, which is sometimes known as the ADO16 because it can carry so many badges. Now, many might assume that the commercially successful Mini, or perhaps even the Morris Minor, was his favourite car, but actually it's the car we're testing today. It's the 1800. Although, unlike the Mini and the Morris Minor, and even that ADO16, which were very well received for their moments in time and are still highly thought of now, the 1800 was sadly marred by problems at the time of launch. And you know what's really irritating is these were silly little things which they really could have overcome with, well, a bit more quality control, if I'm honest. Things like the oil dipstick markings being in the wrong place, which then meant that cars were overfilled with oil. Can you imagine seeing that? You see this new car, it's overfilled with oil, plumes of smoke are coming out the back. It's not going to take you down to the dealership and make you buy one, is it? Now, BMC had put really high targets against these. They thought they were going to be shifting 4,000 units a week. And let's be honest, this just wasn't going to be met. And in fact, I think at peak, they were selling around 40,000 a year. So just really not where they needed to be. Now, it would be doing the car a grave disservice to potter on about the shortcomings of management and the quality control team. Because guess what? They did zero market research before bringing this car to market. So in many ways, meeting the targets of 40,000 was pretty good going. So I think actually it's fairer to look at what it offered in the marketplace at the time. Now remember, this is a front wheel driven car. Now this is all a logical thought on paper creating this car, because essentially they looked at the success of the ADO16s, that's your 1100, 1300, and they went, you know what, why don't we just size it up for the bigger car market? They had the B series 1800cc engine. They knew they had a bit of a design going on, and they said, right, we can do this. So first of all, they fitted that engine transversely. Now you'll sometimes hear this called the east to west fitting. I've seen this on some of the overseas brochures, but what it means is the engine's fitted transversely. What this means for the end user is both the driver and the passengers get plenty of room inside. And what they then did was they coupled this with the hydroelastic suspension. So then you've got a really attractive prospect on paper, because you've got a smooth, roomy ride in a world where many cars were still finding their way with driver and passenger comfort. The roominess, the comfort and the wider wheelbase and Pininfarina styling was essentially billed as an amazing value for money motoring experience, and brochures of the time bill the car not just as a car but as an investment, which is quite a thing. Now, in fact, journalists testing this car pre-launched were invited to come to the Highlands, because what they wanted to do was they wanted to show the car off against impressive landscape, but also to demonstrate that ride comfort. Because when it was up against competitors in the market, things like the Zephyr, the Velux, it did really well, because although it might have had problems in the beginning, the handling, steering and grace with which it took the roads, which were quite rocky in some of those overseas markets it was selling into, made it a really worthy competitor, and one which offered a better driving and riding experience than many cars within its class. But what of the Australian connection? Because of course this is an Australian car we're testing today. Well, when we look at the Australian market, some of the key competitors were people like Ford, Chrysler, Holden, and BMC looked at what these manufacturers were offering, and they were like, they're putting out things like the utility vehicle. That's what's selling well. So they looked at the ADO17 and they then said, right, this will translate really well into a ute. It's got the wider wheelbase, the smooth ride, the transverse engine. So that gives you space, width and ride to create a cracking bit of kit. And what they then did was they had things like the reinforced tailgate, the torsion bar across the back suspension. It then all leads to absorbing heavy loads. And in fact, this car could easily carry, I think it was 1,200 pounds of load. It had 48.5 inches between the wheel arches, and the low load height as well, which was 22 inches, I think, was then easier and faster to load into, but also safer as well because people weren't having to lift as high. Now, whilst this example has been converted slightly with this roof, you can still easily see inside and see the shape and how this would have served the buyer. Sadly, and we talk about this later on in the video, they weren't the big hit they should have been. They weren't made in the UK, and I think they would have been a big hit in the UK. And the reason they weren't a big hit was due to a combination of things. Front wheel drive wasn't as popular as rear wheel drive, and then things like the engine, because the engine was much smaller than what the competitors were putting out, and it just didn't pop like it should have done. And that meant that actually, although it was an option, very few were ever made, and in fact even fewer exist today. This is quite the rare beast. Now, though this particular example has been modified body-wise, actually the running gear is all as it should have been, and the only real thing that's added on to this, which we'll talk about later on, is the power steering unit, which is a massive bonus. Now let me show you this car in a wee bit more detail. Coming inside, it's worthwhile remembering that this wasn't a vehicle that was sold with driver comfort in mind per se, although we're going to talk about that when we go out driving. It was more about what the vehicle's potential was to hold, to carry, and we've talked a lot about that as we've walked around the vehicle, but it is always important to see what you get inside the cabin. Now, you know that it's going to be quite sparse when they're talking about fresh air intake for both driver and passenger. They're talking about plenty of room inside the cabin. You think, I'm not going to have too much going on. Now, let's just address it. It has been modified inside, and in my opinion, modified very tastefully. Quite a lot of modified cars you get and you think they've taken it too far. But this still retains a lot of the originality, so we can see how it would have been, and you still get a fair feel for it. So as you can see, the dash is very Spartan in its layout, but you have got lots of space around you, and in my opinion, you've got everything you need here to have a perfectly good driving experience for the era. Now, one of the things that I do think I'm not sure if it's an original or it's been added in, because I was reading the brochures, and some of the original brochures for these don't have the pictures of inside the ute. They just talk about what they can carry. But I really like this clock up here. Great addition, always good. And if you think about people are using these for business use, for farm use, time is important. So something like that, invaluable. Coming down from there, you've got your speaker built in. You've got your ashtray, because nothing like a ciggy as you go along. You've got your cigar lighter. You come down to your heater. Now, I'm not sure if for the Australian market they had heating inbuilt as standard, because I know, and we're going to talk a little bit about Morris Minors, because they were very popular in Australia in terms of British cars that were exported over. I don't think that was always standard, but in this it seems to be something that's been in it since new. Coming down from there, you've got a sharp all transistor radio. Now, I think that's probably an add-on afterwards, because a lot of BL vehicles were not sold at this stage with entertainment as standard. Coming in front of you here, you've got that ticker tape view that we all know and love. You see it in cars like the 1100, 1300, and you've got it in this one as well. So on it, you've got your temperature gauge to left, you've got your speedo and mileometer in the middle, and over on the right hand side, you've got your fuel gauge. And then you've got two incredibly sturdy buttons either side of that. You've got this one for your lights with a warning light on the dash. Oh, so good, so helpful, because if you've ever been in an old British vehicle, you can quite easily, if you're in a hurry, just get out, leave the lights on and forget. On the right hand side, you've got a single speed wiper on a switch there. Now, that is one thing I would say that I would change about this, that if I'd been the person modifying it, I would have put twin speed wipers in. But thinking about the climate that it was done in Sydney, it might have not been such a big concern as it would be here. To the right of that, you've got your window washers, and apart from an oil pressure gauge, that is pretty much everything you've got. You've also got your indicators on the stalk here and a non-standard steering wheel. Now, I am also wondering if they changed the steering wheel, because those original black ones that you get on cars of this era, oh my goodness, when they heat up and they start peeling and feeling really sweaty and sticky, it's not nice. This is actually very nice. It is quite nice on a cold day like today as well. But what does it sound like? We talked about that 1800 engine as we were walking around. Well, have a listen inside the cabin, and then I'm going to flip you around to the back as well. Can you hear that heater, by the way? It's not noisy, but you can definitely hear it. Right, let's go on an adventure. And that's us very quickly up into fourth gear. So remember, this has only got full forward gears and reverse. And my goodness, what a jolly little car to drive. It's a shame the weather's not better, but we couldn't make everything happen for this test drive. Now, as we come around these roads, and we're coming around some pretty rocky country roads where we're testing today, it's a very good time to talk to you about hydroelastic suspension, which at the time of this being sold was a very big selling point, because the market that they were trying to sell into wasn't just customers who were living in the towns and the more established bit of Australia. They were thinking about people in the outback, in the rural areas, those people that really loved the utes and were the ute buyers, because that hydroelastic suspension meant that no matter what their cargo, they would get there. The cargo would be less bumped about, especially in areas where roads weren't as established as we have nowadays and they have in Australia nowadays. So for people like egg sellers, or maybe people that were carrying fragile goods, they had some level of confidence by buying the Austin 1800 that they were going to get there and their cargo wouldn't be bashed to bits. Now, you might also notice that the steering seems, well, very light for a 1960s car in this, and that's because it's actually had power steering fitted, which is great. And do you know what? It's making the drive today so pleasurable, because sometimes you get in 60s cars, and especially for people that don't drive them regularly, it can feel quite laborious when you're trying to rag it round and move it round. I'm not entirely sure what the system has been taken off, so I apologise, but it's been retrofitted. It wasn't something that was fitted when the vehicle was new. Now, the next thing I want to talk to you about is something they sold the car on when they sold it. And they sold it with the split circuit braking system, and that was standard. And if you're wondering why that's such a big thing, it's because one of the vehicles that had been really popular in Australia, the Morris Minor, was on a single circuit braking system. So what that means is if you've never experienced it, is you can get total brake failure with absolutely no warning whatsoever. So to have that split system in the car was seen as a real boon. It was seen as a massive selling point in an era where not everything was offering that. Another really great feature on these is that you also got, as standard, it wasn't something that you were paying extra for, was you got servo assisted brakes to the front. Now, I believe they were disc brakes as well, and again, that was included within the purchase price. It wasn't something you had to pay extra for. Now, if you're wondering why in an era where that would be totally normal 10 years later to have that on a car, in the 60s at this point, not so. It was still something that was very much a nice to have. But you know what, all of these little details that they built to build these utes made it
so that you can drive it today, and it is so easy to drive. And it's worth talking about driver comfort as well, because although we haven't got the original seats, if you look at the original seats, they were very wide, a little bit like these are actually. I don't think the profile on these in terms of width is much different to the originals, which means you've got plenty of room to sit, you've got plenty of room around you, because the driving culture in Australia, and if you're watching this in England, I didn't fully appreciate this until I visited. It's perfectly normal for people to do 250 miles on a normal day. It wouldn't be a special trip, they just need to get somewhere. So my auntie, for example, lives in Western Australia, and her nearest biggish city, which is probably, you know, her go-to place if she needs anything major outside of the day-to-day bit, is 250 miles. And she'll just do it in a day normally and then do it back. And she thinks that's perfectly normal. And for me, I would be absolutely knackered. That would be like me driving to Portsmouth and back. I just wouldn't do it. So that's why that comfort and these bits and pieces that weren't necessarily standard for us, but were so important in that Australian market. Now, I'll be honest, this really deserved to be sold in this country as well. These would have been such a good thing to sell, because as you can see, we've talked about its load, we've talked about how much weight it can take. That hydroelastic suspension means that you've got really great driver comfort, and you've also got a bit of protection for your cargo as well. All of these things, I think it would have had a place in the British market as well. And it's a real shame that BL didn't take the learnings that they had over there and put them into the market here. Because yeah, okay, it was put out there to compete with Holden, Chrysler, all the rest of it, fine. But what about the market here? Realistically, they could have taken more market share with something like this. This is a great car. However, guess what? Didn't really hit that well in Australia for a number of reasons. First of all, it just really wasn't what they were used to. They were used to 6-cylinder engines. This, of course, wasn't a 6-cylinder engine. So they were a bit like, well, that's what we're used to. We're used to these massive engines because we're doing these massive miles. Is an 1800 enough? They wanted more. They just wanted more space. They wanted just more of everything, really. They wanted rear wheel drive. It didn't quite hit the spot, and that is such a shame, because actually they built a very good utility vehicle. I think that they just sold it into the wrong market. I think really it should have been sold into the British market and other places within the Commonwealth at the time. I think it would have done far better. Now, in terms of my drive today, I've really enjoyed it. It took me a little bit to get my head around that gear change experience. It feels very different to what I'm used to. Feels quite notchy, but look, it's one of those little things to get used to. I've really enjoyed it, and I'm not usually one for a modified vehicle. So thank you very much to the owner for lending us it today. It's been a superb little beast. I personally love how it's been modified. I love that the original shape has been honoured. I love that the original pickup inside is still visible, so you can see the bare bones of where it's come from, and the driving experience isn't too far removed from what it was when it was new. You've just got that little bit of power steering, a nice firm steering wheel in your hand, and slightly comfier seats. So realistically, it's modifications done correctly, because it's just made it all the better. Now, that's it from me today. I really hope you've enjoyed it. I just want to say a massive thank you to everybody who subscribes and watches, and people that don't really subscribe but tune in now and again and watch bits and pieces, and people that leave comments. It means so much. Like, honestly, when I first started the videos, I remember in my head it was a really big goal to hit 500, and I thought, wow, I can't even picture what 500 people in a room would look like. So to hit 50k is enormous. So thank you very much for your support. I hope you've enjoyed the video, and I hope you've enjoyed this 50k special. But as we always say on an I Drive a Classic video, until next time, take care and drive safely.